What were some of the ways debts were successfully consolidated?
We look at this history at length for the case of the 19th century, when there are some really extraordinary examples. The most extreme one probably is Britain coming out of the French and Napoleonic Wars with a debt to GDP ratio of 200%. We in the US came out of the Civil War in 1865 with a substantial debt that it essentially extinguished by running primary budget surpluses year after year for half a century.
Welcome to this podcast produced by the International Monetary Fund. In this episode, economic historian Barry Eichengreen talks to Finance and Development Magazine's Chris Welsh about his latest book, where he seeks to reframe the debate over borrowing by nations.
I think the hope that we can work down our heavy debts the same way they did back then is misplaced.
What are the alternatives?
Well, the only palatable alternative is to grow the economy.
A lot has been said and written about the dangers of government borrowing. In their new book, In Defense of Public Debt, Barry Eichengreen and his co-authors trace the evolution of sovereign debt from the wars of medieval Europe through the COVID-19 crisis, illustrating public debt's many positive uses, from reacting to financial crises to building public works. Eichengreen is a professor of economics and political science at the University of California, Berkeley.
The title, In Defense of Public Debt, has sort of a polemical twist to it. And I'm just wondering why you and your collaborators decided that a defense of public debt was needed, and why right now?
Well, we started on the project before COVID-19. And there was already a lot of worry about mounting public debts in the advanced countries, and more generally, we thought it was important to put that development in its historical context. We saw, for example, in the global financial crisis, how the ability of governments to borrow can play an important role in terms of their capacity to meet emergencies, in that case, a financial emergency. And looking back at history, you see that pattern more generally, that public debt history is punctuated by borrowing to finance wars, beat pandemics. Way back in time in the 14th century, the Italian city-states of Siena and Venice borrowed when the Black Death appeared on their doorsteps in order to meet that public health emergency. And we've seen the same with COVID-19. So there is a sense in which COVID-19 made our case for us.
And how does the historical view help make your case?
The first part of the book is self-consciously Eurocentric, which is not fashionable, but we think appropriate for this case, because borrowing by kings, sovereigns, and states appears first in Europe, because European history is characterized by an unusual frequency of war, reflecting, number one, Europe's political geography, that it has long been divided into myriad different city-states and territorial states that butt up against one another, giving rise to conflict, which in turn reflects, number two, Europe's physical geography as a continent divided by mountain ranges and river valleys. So the history shows that association between war and public borrowing. It shows the association between building durable and legitimate nation states on the one hand, and the ability of the state and its leader, the sovereign, to borrow to defend the citizenry when it comes under attack from outside. And then the story begins to evolve in the 19th and 20th century, when borrowing to finance wars remains important, but you begin to see, in addition, states borrowing to finance economic development, infrastructure investment, roads, bridges, ports, etc. And in the 20th century to finance investments in social programs, and I think less admirably from the point of view of borrowing and incurring debt in order to finance current transfer payments.
Mm-hmm. So just to turn the clock back for a moment to the Italian city-states that you mentioned, that seemed to be the genesis in which sort of small banking houses would lend to kings, which was, of course, a risky business because the king could just say, forget it, I'm not paying you back. So what did they do to defend their interests and protect themselves against the possibility of what I guess today we would call default?
So the Italian banking houses could threaten Edward III of England when he stopped repaying, lack of access to future funding, that they wouldn't lend again in the future when, for reasons, say, related to the 100 Years' War, he became even more desperate to borrow in order to defend himself. There is debate in the literature of economics. Jeremy Bulow and Ken Rogoff wrote a famous article questioning whether this threat of interrupting capital market access is enough to compel a borrower to repay under all circumstances. And we talk a lot about that controversy in the book and about the other things that states did on occasion, lenders did on occasion to enforce their claims. So the Bardi and the other Italian bankers didn't have gunboats. Later, you see, in the 19th century, you see creditor nations begin to utilize military means as well. The lenders, even back in the 14th century, could form cohesive cartels to try to lend credibility to their threat to curtail capital market access. So that is what they did.
And you talk a little bit about in your book about how that led to the development of financial markets. I mean, there was sort of a transition from private banking houses to financial markets. Can you tell us how that happened?
As military technology develops, the need to borrow in order to finance a defensive war, for example, that becomes more expensive. So more debt is incurred and larger loans have to be underwritten. So that means concentrating them in the hands of a relatively small number of family members who are the partners in the family bank becomes increasingly problematic. You want to be able to market the loans to a growing range of investors. So you begin to see the development of markets through which that can be done, and the infrastructure that makes markets work. Come the 17th century, you see the appearance of central banks to provide liquidity to those markets, a variety of mechanisms for providing information to investors. And then you see what we argue in the book is a critical development, which is the use of public debt as it is traded, and it comes to be recognized as a safe and liquid investment. It is then offered by individuals as collateral for other loans that they, as non-state entities, wish to secure. So you see this complementarity between the development of markets and public debt and the development of private financial markets.
And you also talk about this fascinating process whereby the development of debt and debt instruments leads to the development of the modern sort of, you might say, bureaucratic state and eventually, democratic institutions. How did that work?
You alluded before, Chris, to the commitment problem that a sovereign would face as the highest earthly power, Edward III of England or Louis XIV of France. No one could compel him to repay. So that posed a problem from the point of view of the lenders and by implication for the borrower as well. The lenders charged very high interest rates. They included a risk premium in the interest rate on their loans to protect themselves against that eventuality. But over time, political institutions developed which constrained, to an extent, the sovereign, political checks and balances, if you will. The development of legislatures and parliaments, representative assemblies, in which the creditors sat, that whose authorization had to be secured in order for the sovereign to borrow or raise taxes.
So, how did the ability to borrow affect the fortunes of war?
If you look at the histories of the long 17th and 18th century with the repeated conflicts between France and England, for example, where France, in terms of GDP and population, was the much larger economy, it was weaker militarily because of its more antiquated and limited fiscal capacity, that the king persisted in outsourcing to private agents, tax farmers, they were called, responsibility for raising revenues. And like in many other economic contexts, there was a principal agent problem where what the people with boots on the ground, the tax farmers, did was not always what the principal, the king in Paris, might have wished. So French revenues lagged behind, French military capacity lagged behind, and the English were triumphant in those conflicts more often than not because they could issue more debt.
And of course, in some of these cases, the conflict, which sort of the wars which gave rise to the need for debt in the first place, often gave rise to what were considered to be unsustainable debts, and they were followed by periods of debt consolidation. And I think you give the examples of the Franco-Prussian War and the Civil War in the U.S. What were some of the ways debts were successfully consolidated?
We look at this history at length for the case of the 19th century, when there are some really extraordinary examples. The most extreme one probably is Britain coming out of the French and Napoleonic Wars with a debt to GDP ratio of 200% in circa 1821, twice what the US or the Euro area have at the moment. And that debt was basically paid off. The debt to GDP ratio fell to almost nothing, still positive, but barely over the 90 years between the end of the French and Napoleonic Wars and World War I. And Britain achieved that by running budget surpluses, by running primary budget surpluses, primary meaning net of interest payments on the debt, which economists typically account for separately, year after year for more than 90 years, with the sole exception, I think it was, of 1901, a year of the Boer War. Another similar example would be the United States. After the Civil War, came out of the Civil War in 1865 with a substantial debt that it essentially extinguished over the subsequent 50 years. Federal government debt had been eliminated all but completely by 1913. So a lot of people say mistakenly that the United States achieved this entirely by growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, where in fact GDP grew fast because of immigration and investment and technical change in the United States, but interest payments on the debt grew even faster. The interest rate on the debt was higher than the growth rate of the economy. So we in the US extinguished our debt by running primary budget surpluses year after year for half a century, basically with the sole exception of the years of the Spanish-American War. So the subtext here is that the political economy was very different back then than it is now in the age of the universal franchise, in an era of political polarization in many countries, it's hard to get society and its political representatives to agree on the compromises needed to run primary budget surpluses and sustain them for decades or years. So I think the hope that we can work down our heavy debts the same way they did back then is misplaced.
What are the alternatives?
Well, the only palatable alternative is to grow the economy. So coming out of World War II, that was a big part of the way that advanced economies dealt with their inherited debts. That was a period of fast growth. When we did succeed in growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio. So we can hope that something similar might happen now as a result of the digital revolution, faster productivity growth, although I'm somewhat skeptical.
So what are the other options besides growth?
Beyond that, we have available inflation, which has costs, hidden form of taxation that is distortionary and socially divisive, as we read in the newspapers at the moment, and default and restructuring, which comes with costs ranging from bankruptcy for debt holders if the debt is held by domestic financial institutions, for example, international recrimination, and so forth. So I think we can hope for a bit of fiscal consolidation going forward, although not on 19th century standards. I think we can hope for somewhat faster growth going forward, and the public investment, productive public investment we're beginning to see in the US and Europe, I think is a positive from that point of view. And we may see a little bit of additional inflation going forward.
So that also raises the question of how much debt is too much. I mean, before the global financial crisis, there were a great deal of fear that, if you had too much debt, that would lead to a, sharp currency crisis, global financial conflagration, and yet that hasn't happened and debt has continued to rise. So have economists figured out how much debt is sustainable and how much is too much?
Yes, they have. So economists have concluded that it depends. In other words, we first had a school of economic thought that there existed magic numbers that determined the dividing line between enough and too much, and that numbers were, for the advanced economies, in the range of 90% of GDP. Then we had modern monetary theory, which said there is no such thing as too much because governments can simply print money to finance their activities, and the central bank can purchase however much public debt is required to keep that government expenditure flowing. So I would not adhere to either of those views. And if you're a student of history, I think you understand immediately that it depends on the circumstances, on the political, financial, and economic circumstances.
And of course, a high debt load can restrict your capacity to borrow in the future.
If you think a geopolitical event or another novel coronavirus or a climate-related disaster is imminent, then it's urgent to try to reduce the debt load to restore the capacity of the government to borrow again in the next emergency. If you think those threats are not so immediate, then you would attach less urgency to debt consolidation. So I myself worry about the urgency of all those threats. That's why I think governments need to move soon in order to restore and enhance their capacity to borrow.
And I think many economists were saying something similar before the COVID crisis. And I think the mantra at the IMF was fix the roof while the sun is shining because you need to, have some spare fiscal ammunition in case another crisis comes around. The roof wasn't fixed, and which makes me wonder why it wasn't fixed before the COVID crisis. But also, it turned out that governments had plenty of ammunition to fight the COVID crisis, despite the warnings.
Well, we can thank our lucky stars that the real interest rate on public debt, what economists call R-star, has been coming down for the last couple of decades, which allowed governments to borrow again in response to COVID-19, despite not having fixed the roof. And the problem going forward is there's no guarantee that R-star will stay down where it is.
And of course, at some point, excessive, unsustainable debt can lead to a crisis and has led to crises in the past, and you review some of them in your book. Latin America, for example, governments borrowed recklessly. What was the problem there? How did those crises come about in the 1980s and 1990s?
Well, I think the succession of Latin American debt crises, there were problems on all sides. So there were problems on the side of the lenders, who often lent too indiscriminately, not having had much recent experience with lending to developing countries in the 1970s. Money center banks lent indiscriminately. The international bond market having been inactive for half a century, investors in emerging market bonds lent to indiscriminately in the 1990s. And when free money or almost free money is on offer, the temptation for governments to borrow, again, in environments like those in many Latin American countries where there is a polarized polity and lots of electoral uncertainty, who's going to be in office next year, the temptation is to borrow.
That actually leads to my next question, which was about the Asian financial crisis. How does the Asian financial crisis figure in your history?
Yeah, the Asian financial crisis is a reminder that the line between public debt and private debt is difficult to draw. And that's another reason why I don't believe in magic numbers, that there is some number that you can pick out from the public sector accounts that indicates when the debt load begins to be a problem, because governments have contingent liabilities. There are contingencies under which they have to assume responsibility for private debts. The fund worries about this a lot. I wish financial markets worried about it more. But we see it at work at the moment in the case of the property and real estate sector in China, where these are private debts, but how much responsibility the Chinese government may ultimately have to take for them remains to be seen. So that problem was extremely prominent in cases like Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea in 1997-98, because the governments had enlisted private commercial banks and property developers in their economic development plans. Governments had implicitly said, please borrow and undertake these investments as part of our national development strategy. So when problems arose, governments were obliged to step in and assume some of those liabilities.
Going back to just briefly and finally to the post-COVID outlook, you talked about political polarization, which seems to be on the rise. And you talked about the influence of different parties and interest groups and how the pressure always seems to be to spend more and tax less. On balance, are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to the outlook for consolidating the gigantic debts countries have amassed?
I think it's going to be a heavy lift, but I try to stay optimistic. So I think there are some positive developments, such as tentative agreement on a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. So part of the problem with using tax policy to contribute to the process of debt consolidation is that factors are mobile, and if you try to raise taxes on a mobile factor like capital, its owners will relocate that asset to another country. So I think that has been an important element behind why corporate tax rates have trended downward in a wide variety of countries over the last 3 or 4 decades. So I think there are ways to counter this trend. I would like to think that in the United States, we will move eventually to a more efficient value-added tax than our inherited patchwork sales taxes and so forth. So by having made that last comment, you can tell I'm an optimist.
Thank you, Barry. I really appreciate the time you've taken to talk.
It was fun. Thank you, Chris.
That was economic historian Barry Eichengreen talking about his new book, In Defense of Public Debt, to Finance and Development Magazine's Chris Welsh. You'll find all kinds of exclusive FND articles and interviews like this one at imf.org/FND. And look for other IMF podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.